Hello, lovelies. Today we're going to have a little bit of a flashback, if you will. It's interesting on the anniversary of the OGL debacle, when Wizards/Hasbro tried to put the Open Gaming License genie back into the bottle. It's interesting to look back on the advent of the Open Gaming License and the kind of things that went on then. Plus, people are sometimes, occasionally, curious why I'm against, well, not exactly against, but why I'm less enamored with generic systems, and particularly why perhaps I might be hostile to people using OSR-derived systems for anything and everything, or why I might be hostile to using 5th edition D&D for just about anything. But this goes back to the days of the Open Gaming License in its infancy, and the way that anything and everything was brought out compatible with D20, as it was so called back then, even when it was manifestly unsuited to do so. And even Wizards were slow off the mark with some of this. D20 Modern came out in 2002, which I believe was after Spycraft, which was a modern setting. A couple of other games that were D20 derived. And the Call of Cthulhu D20 system came out in 2002 as well. The D20 system is not particularly well suited to modern style gaming, hit point bloat, all of that kind of thing. These are not conducive to a modern, fast-paced, kinetic sort of game. And yet, despite all that, D20 Modern did have some redeeming qualities. Now, it's almost entirely rules. This is an aspect of the 3rd edition era of the D20 glut. And this is all slight modifications on the D20 rule system, on the 3rd edition rule set. That can trip you up a bit, because many of the differences are subtle or forgettable. And a problem I have with a lot of games as I get older is that they have new editions where they have changed terminology, or it's a slightly different interpretation of a rule, and so I'm not sure whether I'm remembering correctly from the current edition. And this was similar at the time. But that said, 3rd edition is probably my favourite D&D edition, and the sheer expansiveness of the D20 system did have some things going for it. The network externalities, as they say. You know, it was easier to find players, and you could mix and match materials across all sorts of things. Now, there isn't really a background in the book per se. Most of it's implicit. There's a few suggestions for names of organizations and things, and bits and bobs that show up from D&D's past or TSR's past and spin-off games. And D20 Modern would form the basis for D20 Future, which was a supplement for D20 Modern, and various other incarnations. Some other companies, third-party companies, would go on to use D20 Modern as a basis for their games, but there was such a glut of D20 games, and this was an earlier boom cycle. People are talking about the end of the D&D golden age or whatever. We've been here before. There was a height of popularity in the 80s. There was a height of popularity in the 2000s. And there's been a height of popularity during 5th edition. Every 10 to 20 years, it seems there is a new boom and bust cycle. But this is the D20 one. The USP of D20 Modern, which did have a fine pedigree of designers involved with some sort of modern spin. Charles Ryan, former of Chameleon Eclectic, did Millennium's End, for example, which was a whole counter-terrorism RPG, very complicated, very modern for its time. So you would have thought this would have been a bit better, but really the main USP, unique selling point for D20 Modern, was the way the characters were created. Instead of having conventional classes, you had categories really based upon the statistic that you wanted to focus on. So for each statistic, you have a type of hero. The strong hero, the fast hero, the tough hero, the smart hero, the dedicated hero, and the charismatic hero. And so for your first 10 levels at least, you would be one of these types of hero, derived usually from whichever statistic you had that was the highest. You then had occupations, which were kind of like backgrounds in 5th edition D&D. And all of these bits and pieces would interact to end up creating your character. You also had action points, which were kind of similar to inspiration. So that made for a more cinematic game, and this was something that didn't exist in the fantasy version. This would enable you to alter roles, or some special talents, class features, and so on would require action points to be spent. But these were a form of narrative mechanic, a little bit similar to inspiration, that would let you alter the game in some limited way. Now, because you were divided by statistical category, and because multi-classing was so easy in older editions, this extended and advanced the degree of character customization that you could have in 3rd edition D&D. So you could quite easily mix and match different bits and pieces of adventurer type together, and later on you could then specialize into subclasses or focus your area, once you were past 10th level, into something more particular. And if you wanted to be a magic user, you could do that at higher levels. The skill system was a lot more involved than we see in 5th edition today. It wasn't just a broad category of proficiency, but an actual active, proper skill system. You already had that in D20 Fantasy, 3rd edition D&D, but being modern, the skill list was a lot more expansive and a lot more involved. So again, this gave you a degree of character customization and speciality that has been simply absent from 5th edition D&D and 4th edition D&D. Something I wish they'd go back to is the more detailed, more adaptable skill system, because maybe you don't want to be super good at some skills associated with your class, but you do want to be super skilled in relation to other ones. But fat chance of that happening. Feats were a lot more important back in 3rd edition days, and that's perhaps reflected by the list you see here. And the beauty of it was that a lot of people were publishing books of feats and things at the time, and they were all quite broadly compatible. Now you had, obviously, gear and weapons, armor tended to work in the usual sort of way, and you had big, quite generic lists of firearms. But you see, this is where the D20 system tended to fall down. It's where a lot of D&D derived systems tend to fall down. The bloated video game health bar approach to what makes a big tough baddie, and the conflict between the alleged abstraction of hit points and how much damage you can dole out with a particular weapon, becomes difficult quite rapidly. If we consider that a dagger does a d4 damage, a 9mm pistol in this sort of game would do 2d6, which is a significant amount of damage compared to a dagger, but not significant compared to how many hit points particularly higher level characters or monsters might have. When to replicate the action tropes, you might want it actually to be reflected in missing quite often, but then when you do hit, doing a significant amount of damage. So that's where, for me and a lot of people, I think there is this disconnect between older style D&D type systems and genre emulation or plausibility or quasi-realism, and the same with vehicles, where they tended to just have a lot of hit points, or often not even that many hit points really when you consider it. That's also been a problem I've found with the newer edition of Cyberpunk. Vehicles have hit points, but they don't have enough hit points to reflect how much damage they should be able to soak up before becoming non-functional. Combat isn't that, it'll be broadly familiar but slightly more crunchy compared to what a lot of people are used to, so we don't really need to spend a great deal of time on that, so skip to the end. So instead of prestige classes, which was the term for 3rd edition fantasy and so on, we had advanced classes. So this was where you chose to specialize down from your broader category. So you had options like the martial artist, which is very similar to the monk, gunslinger, particularly specific modern class, infiltrator for commandos, shinobi, that sort of thing. Bodyguards as protectors, field scientists if you wanted to focus on your more intelligent side, techies if you wanted to make stuff, repair stuff, put stuff together, field medic if you wanted to look after other people, media personalities, negotiators, and so on. And there were magic classes later on if you wanted to run a more supernatural game. You had some generic advice, largely repetition, like these kind of things already are. And this is where you started to get some of the implicit setting, which from the writing in the book and from the art in the book was clearly meant to be that there was some sort of shadowy version of a fantasy world, kind of like a not quite as futuristic Shadowrun. There was quite a robust system for creating monsters and creatures and so on by deciding upon their category and being guided through, giving them their particular traits and so on. That was very accessible, and other than the statistic as class thing, was probably the main selling point of D20 Modern, in that it made creating monsters and so on a real relatively quick breeze, while such rules were largely missing from the fantasy version of the game. And despite this being a singular core book, not split out into monster manual and so on, there were quite a lot of examples given. and it was relatively easy again to just use whatever you wanted from any D20 system that you could think of, really. So we're largely done with this review here. So not a review, really, more of a discussion. I don't think anyone really needs a review of a game from 2002. But there was no real wasted space in this book. It was packed from beginning to end with rules and useful stuff, character classes, character advanced classes. There was a proper decent index, and if we look at this, which is a 22-year-old game book, the layout is nothing special. It's a bit crowded, but it's fairly clear and readable. If we look at the art, it is relatively high contrast. It pops out of the page. The action scenes where we see them are quite well done. You see a character in action with an engaging pose. The art style and presentation back then was a lot more effective, a lot more visually stimulating and interesting, a lot more inspiring than the modern muddy mess of art that we tend to get. The subtle tones, the stuff washed together, the muddiness, as I say. So it's interesting to look back and see that the presentation used to be so much better, even when there was less money sloshing around. It's a shame things have regressed so far. So yeah, D20 Modern, it's an interesting thing to look back at, to see how even Wizards was tailoring different versions of its systems to try and reflect different genres, how that failed, but how they were also a bit more innovative, a bit more risk-taking for them, which isn't saying that much at the time, and how as a result we ended up with some interesting artifacts like D20 Modern, like its status class idea and splitting 20 levels between status class and the advanced class and so on, but also its failings in that it never really properly addressed the shortcomings of the D20 system when it came to modern style of play, how there never was really a proper setting for it, and how so much was left to third parties who frankly had already covered a lot of this ground by the time it came out, with other D20 games using a system that was manifestly unsuited to what they were trying to do with it. So there are lessons, kids, from the past that we can learn about the applicability of systems, about the importance of tailoring or using different systems to support and reinforce the genre that you're trying to show. It was always visually interesting, and the implied setting with these hidden monsters in the real world, Shadowrun without cybernetics, was intriguing and interesting, but they never really did anything with it. But a lot of the D20 stuff from the past, I think, is a cautionary tale not to just use the most popular system for whatever game that you're creating, or at least that you can customize systems to a larger extent than most people are. If I had to give D20 Modern a score, in terms of style, I'd give it a 3, but that's really only due to the overcrowding that there is present here. The art is better than modern D&D. The content is better and better presented than most modern D&D, but it is just overcrowded. In terms of substance, you can't really fault D20 Modern on substance. While it lacks a background, a setting, there's not really any wasted space in the book. So you were getting a lot more value for money back in 2002 than you've been getting from Wizards for the last 5-10 years or so on. So if I had to give it a score, I'd give it a high 4, almost a 5 for substance. So that would be 7 to 8 out of 10, 3.5 to 4 out of 5. It's an interesting artifact. If you're interested in looking at how Wizards and a lot of other D20 game producers back in the day approached certain design issues, it's worth picking either this up or a second-hand copy of Mongoose's D20 Modern Pocket Edition, something like that. And D20 Future is certainly interesting on top of this. So it's educational if you're a game designer, especially if you're working on a D20 derived system like the OSR, or something that's 5th edition compatible, or 6th edition coming along soon. It's worth checking out some of the old D20 material. I would say particularly the stuff that pushed the envelope a bit more. So D20 Modern, Mutants and Masterminds, that sort of thing might be useful to you. Zang.
Do you like t-shirts?
Yeah, boy!
Do you like games?
Certainly.
Are you perhaps a little bit kinky?
Yes, quite.
Then buy one of our B&D t-shirts at Teespring. Teespring.com/stores/postmortem-studios. You want to be cool, don't you?
Does the word duh mean anything to you?
The gallows is cold and the gibbet is lonely. We'll make things hot for you here. The gallows is cold and the gibbet is lonely. We'll make things hot for you, Joe.